In Greek, Jesus was executed on a stauros. Is this a cross or stake? This video presentation will look at what the evidence really says. The cross is the most common way of depicting Jesus' death and is used in the majority of Bible translations. This is depicted as the letter T, either in upper or lower case. However, the New World Translation printed by Jehovah's Witnesses uses the word stake, a simple upright wooden beam. When critics make claims in favour of the cross, they will point to what Greek lexicons say about stauros, commentary from the early church fathers, archaeological evidence, and other scriptures from the Bible which supposedly support a cross. Whilst this presentation is not intended to be exhaustive, we will look at these claims and provide a defence for a stake used in the New World Translation. The 16th century philosopher Justus Lipsius gave illustrated depictions of a crux, the Latin word for cross, ranging from an upright stake to which a man is affixed by impalement or nails, as well as a T-shaped and X-shaped cross. He supported the view that Jesus died on a cross. Critics also point to definitions in Greek lexicons such as BDAG and the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament that allows stauros to be translated as both stake and cross. However, as well as being noted as useful resources, these have famously received criticism from Scottish scholar James Barr as containing bias due to being as much an interpretation of the New Testament as a guide to the semantics. Hence a reader needs to be cautious even when reading biblical lexicons. They may not be free from the biases of the authors. However, there is plenty of support from lexicons and other writings supporting Jesus' death on a stake. For instance, Vine's expository of New Testament words under cross says the following: Stauros denotes primarily an upright pale or stake. On such malefactors were nailed for execution. Both the noun and the verb stauru, to fasten to a stake or pale, are originally to be distinguished from the ecclesiastical form of a two-beamed cross. The shape of the latter had its origin in ancient Chaldea, and was used as a symbol of the god Tammuz, being in the shape of the mystic Tau, the initial of his name, in that country and in adjacent lands, including Egypt. By the middle of the 3rd century AD, the churches had either departed from or had travestied certain doctrines of the Christian faith. In order to increase the prestige of the apostate ecclesiastical system, pagans were received into the churches apart from regeneration by faith, and were permitted largely to retain their pagan signs and symbols. Hence the Tau or T, in its most frequent form, with the crosspiece lowered, was adopted to stand for the cross of Christ. As noted, the origins of the shape of the cross predate Christianity. There is a wealth of material that backs this up. For instance, the cross in ritual architecture and art. It is strange yet unquestionably a fact that in ages long before the birth of Christ, and since then in lands untouched by the teaching of the Church, the cross has been used as a sacred symbol. The Greek Bacchus, the Tyrian Tammuz, the Chaldean Bel, and the Norse Odin were all symbolized to their votaries by a cruciform device. Also, in archaeological evidence of church life before Constantine, Professor Graydon F. Schneider points out the universal use of the sign of the cross is a striking contrast to the distinct lack of crosses in early Christian remains. In the Curious Myths of the Middle Ages, Baring Gould devotes an entire section of the book to the legend of the cross, and details different types of crosses accredited with having mystical powers all over the world. See the link in the description to read the entire chapter. Critics claim the early church fathers supported the cross. One of the most popular is Irenaeus. He was born circa 130 AD and is known as an early church father who worked to combat the influences of Gnosticism on Christianity. In his writings against heresies, he comments, "The very form of the cross too has 5 extremities, 2 in length, 2 in breadth, and 1 in the middle, on which the person rests who is fixed by the nails. He's referencing a lowercase t cross. What can be said about Irenaeus is that the quote was made in about 180 AD, almost 150 years after the death of Jesus, so he would have had to rely on at least second-hand information. Also, Irenaeus has been faulted for trying too hard in refuting Gnostics, and in discussing the 5 points of the cross is delving into interpretations of prophecy and mysticism around the number 5, which may have influenced his description of the Stauros. On top of this, Irenaeus also thought Jesus may have lived to close to 50 years old. Referencing John chapter 8, he says of Jesus, fittingly applied to one who has already passed the age of 40, without having as yet reached his 50th year, yet is not far from this latter period. However, it's generally accepted that Jesus died in his early 30s. In the non-Christian cross, John Parsons concludes, even granting that Irenaeus must have been mistaken, his evidence nonetheless affects one of the most important points debated in this work. For it is clear that even if he knew so little about the execution of Jesus, the details of that execution cannot have been particularly well known, and the affirmation that the stauros to which Jesus was affixed had a transverse bar attached may have had no foundation in fact, and may have arisen from a wish to connect Jesus with that well-known and widely venerated symbol of life, the pre-Christian cross. But what about the letter of Barnabas, which is quoted by critics as supporting the cross in chapter 9 verse 8? The quote reads, "For the scripture saith, And Abraham circumcised of his household 18 males and 300. What then was the knowledge given unto him? Understand ye that he saith the 18 first, and then after an interval 300. In the 18, I stands for 10, H for 8. Here thou hast Jesus. And because the cross in the T was to have grace, he saith also 300. So he revealeth Jesus in the 2 letters, and the remaining one the cross." Whilst it's true the cross is mentioned, there are 2 important points to bear in mind. First, there is much speculation regarding the dating of the letter. Scholar Everett Ferguson says, "The Epistle of Barnabas is usually dated to 132 to 135, although an earlier date in the late 70s has had its champions, and 96 to 98 is a possibility. So it's either impossible or unlikely in the extreme that the writer was an eyewitness. More importantly, however, is his statement about the shape of the cross, which he creates a link seemingly out of nowhere using biblical numerology to the 318 servants mentioned in Genesis circumcised by Abraham, and the uppercase T shape of the cross to Jesus, which may have influenced his thoughts on the cross. As John Parsons writes, in the Epistle of Barnabas are various references to the stauros, mixed up with various passages from the Hebrew scriptures, quoted without any justification. Much more can be said about references that supposedly support the notion of a cross from the early church fathers. However, having discussed 2 of the most prominent ones in Barnabas and Irenaeus, even in these there is disagreement on the shape, with Barnabas opting for an uppercase T and Irenaeus a lowercase t. Proponents of the cross also point to the staurogram used in the Bodmer Papyri P45, P66 and P75. Emphasis is given to P66, which has been thought of as being the earliest, and is said to be one of the oldest and best preserved manuscripts of the Gospel of John. The language is Greek, and the staurogram is a ligature of the tau and rho from the word stauros, which looks like a cross, and has been touted as being a visual representation of Jesus on a cross, used as shorthand in place of writing out the word stauros. However, there are several points to note. First of all, the idea that the staurogram is a visual depiction of Jesus on a cross has only been theorized. Second is the dating. In 1961, the papyrus was dated by Hunger of being between 100 to 150 AD. In 1956, Martin had initially dated them to 200 AD. Both of these dates have recently been called into question by Brent Nongri, who had a much later date of the middle of the 4th century. Whichever date is correct, they are all many decades or centuries following Jesus' death, which reduces their value in determining the form of the stauros. Third, the staurogram closely resembles the Egyptian hieroglyph Ankh, which means life. Professor Matthew Black quotes the theory of Jean de Savonargues, who admits a difficulty in the acceptance of a pagan symbol by a religion born out of Judaism. Gnostic Christianity, however, had no such scruples, and provided the channel of the introduction of the pagan symbol. Valentmus, who gives a central place to the cross in his thought, has already associated it with the tree of life. Torreson and Matson add, that there were found in Egypt fortifies the above argument that the staurograms could be a result of Gnostic influence. So much for the Bodmer papyri. In 1856, near Palatine Hill in Rome, an ancient piece of graffiti was found showing a figure with the head of an animal and the body of a man. Next to this is the picture of a man, and the inscription beneath it reads, Alexamenos adores his god. No fixed date can be given for this graffiti, and estimates range from the late 1st to the late 3rd century. Around this time and before it, religious groups would poke fun at others by accusing them of worshipping a donkey. This was particularly the case of pagans against Jews and 1st century Christians. Therefore, this graffiti is said by many to be a mockery of a Christian drawn by a cheeky Roman by depicting Jesus with the head of a donkey on a cross. However, this is not a universal view. There are several points to note. First, look carefully at the graffiti. It has been said that the cross may not have even been a part of the original graffiti, but drawn on afterwards. The cross is on top of the image of the figure. The figure is also standing, not suspended. Other commentators have argued it is in fact the head of an Egyptian god. As scholar Gunnar Samuelson says, the possibility that the inscription depicts an act of worship of Egyptian gods such as Anubis or Seth, or a man engaged in a Gnostic ceremony involving a horse-headed figure, could not be ruled out. The strange sign in the top right could point in that direction. Within Sethian Gnosticism, they prayed to the god Typhon Seth, who had a donkey head as a symbol, with from time to time had an upsilon in the right side of the head. What about John chapter 20 verse 25 and the number of nails? Doesn't this prove the cross? In many pieces of artwork that are used in literature published by Jehovah's Witnesses, they show a single nail going through both wrists of Jesus on an upright pole, as is the case here. Is this right? What does John chapter 20 verse 25 say? Quoting Thomas, it says, "Unless I see in his hands the imprint of the nails, and put my finger into the place of the nails." So, does this mean that the image of a single nail is incorrect, and actually it is one nail per hand on either side of a crossbeam? Note what is said by a commentary from McClintock on Strong's. Much time and trouble have been wasted in disputing as to whether 3 or 4 nails were used in fastening the Lord. Nonus affirms that 3 only were used, in which he is followed by Gregory Nazianzen. The more general belief gives 4 nails, an option which is supported at much length and by curious arguments by Curtius. Others had carried the number of nails as high as 14. Clearly, the number of nails does not have to have any bearing on the shape of the stauros. The other word used instead of stauros for the instrument of Jesus' execution is zulon. Under the heading of tree, Fiennes describes zulon as meaning wood, a piece of wood, anything made of wood, is used with the rendering tree of the cross, the tree being the stauros, the upright pale or stake to which Romans nailed those who were thus to be executed. Afterwards, it lists several Bible references that use xulon instead of stauros, one of which is 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 24, referring to Jesus' execution, where in many translations it's translated not as cross, but as tree, or even stake. The Greek Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, contains an example of the use of xulon in Ezra, and I issued a decree that any man who violates this edict, a timber, xulon, shall be drawn from his house, and he shall be impaled. The English is timber, which is taken from a person's house, a simple straight piece of wood which someone would be impaled upon. This does not sound anything like a cross. If we go on to the book of Esther, there is another use of xulon in the Septuagint, this time in describing the instrument that was used to impale Haman, which in here is translated as pole. Interestingly, the verb used for impaling is stauru, related to the noun stauros. Neither of these gives any indication that stauros or xulon would mean a cross. As John Parsons says, it need only be added that there is not a single sentence in any of the numerous writings forming the New Testament which, in the original Greek, bears even indirect evidence to the effect that the stauros used in the case of Jesus was other than an ordinary stauros, much less to the effect that it consisted not of one piece of timber, but of two pieces nailed together in the form of a cross.